Okay. Hello, everybody. So I will start with presenting and welcoming our dear speaker. So Bob Fischer. Bob Fischer is a senior researcher at Rethink Priorities, a professor of philosophy at Texas State University, and the director of both the Anthropoda, this is how you pronounce it, Anthropoda Foundation and the Animal Welfare Economics Working Group. He led Rethink Priorities Moral Weight Project and launched Rethink Priorities Worldview Investigation Team. Since then, he's been working on insect sentience and welfare. Please welcome Bob Fischer. So one comment from me, I would like it to be more of a fireside chat. So, let's imagine that we are all sitting next to a fireplace and we are talking in casual way. So I would like it to be, I will try to ask your questions during the chat. So please don't hesitate to ask them straight away. I will try to, if they're good, of course. So please do your best. Ask them to Bob. Or at least controversial. So don't wait for Q&A. We'll do it during the chat. And also I will ask some rapid questions at the end that should be also, interesting for Bob. So stay till the end to see what Bob will say. Okay, so Bob, I want to ask you about your origin story. Me as a European, I think I have quite good recollection of when I first encountered your work in person. I think it was 2022 in Washington in a Rethink Priorities Coordination Forum, and you were presenting some of your research that you've done. And it struck me as, first, like you're a very good speaker, very eloquent, but also there was this interesting, very deep questions addressed and moved to, let's see, what we know about sentience, what we know about animals, and it struck me as like very profoundly important and maybe very missing from the movement. But I, as European, and I'm quite ignorant about Americans, and I didn't know about you before. How did it happen that you appeared, and now you're in a podcast, you write things, as we saw, like there's so many things you do for animals. How did it happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, I was like wasting my life in academia for a long time. I took the traditional track, join the military, get injured, go to school, become a philosopher, work on stuff that's not connected to animals, and then suddenly decide like maybe I should only think about animals. Then randomly get hired by Rethink Priorities through like completely bizarre circumstances. And then decide like, hey, maybe teaching and publishing should not be my main way that I try to have any influence at all. What if I instead try to do like very impact-oriented research and launch stuff that doesn't exist and I think should exist? So essentially what you're watching is the transition of someone who, thought that like writing one more book was the answer, and like that was the main thing that I should be doing, to someone who is like, oh, yeah, I wish I had been doing the kind of work that, Josh Bach has been doing for 20 years, and I'm trying to catch up now and like make amends for spending so much time thinking about questions that like very clearly don't matter.
But you say you were randomly recruited. Was there anything that, changed your outlook on animals? Or like, why did you, I'm not sure how typical it is to, get wounded in military and then go for animals for anybody here. It's not my story, but was there any maybe turning point that made you consider this?
So what happened was, I stopped eating animals a long time ago, like over 20 years ago, for like not particularly thoughtful reasons. Driving down the highway with my wife, we pass a truck full of pigs. She starts to cry. I'm like, well, maybe we just shouldn't eat them anymore. And she's like, okay. And that was that. And like no further serious reflection. Kept going, doing the research that I was doing that was on like philosophy of science and epistemology and like wasn't thinking about animal issues. And then I got a job as a philosopher of science and epistemologist. And then this very senior guy in the department was like, I don't know why they hired you because I'm teaching those courses till I die. And the department chair was like, oh, well, like maybe you could do ethics courses. And I had never taken an ethics course. But I said, of course, absolutely I can, would love to do it, etc. And then once I sort of had to start teaching ethics, I thought, well, there are these ethical issues that I care about. So I will just start doing some work in this vein. Next thing you know, it has really snowballed. All I was doing was animal-related work, but it was still just like very narrowly academic work, you know. Internecine debates among philosophers about the scope of our obligations to non-human animals, blah, blah, blah. Like, perfectly fine and interesting in that narrow world, but not impact-oriented, not thinking about what actually mattered for trying to, you know, change attitudes toward animals. And it was essentially being recruited to do the moral weight project at Rethink Priorities that got me thinking, yeah, what have I been doing? Like, why was I so focused on this? So I really credit Rethink Priorities for basically saying, we care about doing impact-oriented research. Do you want to do impact-oriented research? And just simply asking the question was enough for me to think, yeah, why wasn't I doing this before? But of course, in the circles that I was in, nobody did that. You know, no one thought about those questions.
So we're at Care Conference here. We like to talk about failures, fuck-ups. Do you look at this past Bob and think like he was mistaken? Was it like what was the biggest mistake that maybe could put you on a path of impact earlier if you consider now that this is the thing you should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, so I do have lots of regrets. I regret becoming a philosopher. Wish I hadn't, to be honest. There are lots of other ways I think I could have done lots of good in the world. Some of them probably at least as good, if not, you know, more good than I've done now. But I took this path, and I'm trying to leverage the resources and opportunities that I have in this particular moment. Insofar as some of the work has been impactful, that's great, and I'm really pleased about that. But in terms of like mistakes I made, I don't know that. So I even though I think, yeah, it's really unfortunate, I'm not so sure how much it was a mistake as much as in terms of the trajectory in that I was really just part of a system that did the same thing that has happened to so many of you and at various points in your life, I'm sure, and gives you this impression like, oh yeah, like do the normal thing, do the conventional thing, go get this nice job, like just, you know, follow your curiosity, follow your passions, do the things that you enjoy, and not, hey, there's a problem in the world and we should be optimizing for addressing that particular problem. And I just was, you know, I was part of that way of thinking, and I didn't really push back and question it. I was someone who has, you know, a critical thinker in the philosopher's sense, where like the problems I actually turned my intellectual attention to, I could think about in a careful and serious way. But like just mostly I didn't turn my attention to the right problems. You know, I was worried about how we know certain kinds of mathematical truths are necessarily true, which is like even saying the sentence, I hate myself for like, but I cared about that so much. I was so invested. I wrote hundreds of pages about that. Because, you know, I was part of a community that said that your curiosity and your interests are like the most important things to be pursuing, you know? And it was a mistake to invest in a community like that.
So you joke that you hate yourself for that, but is there like actual, some emotional baggage that you carry with you for that? For like maybe, and I don't want to say wasting your life, but like in terms of impact, not having as big impact as you could have. Is there anything that like impacts you, or you're just stable, fine? Like there was things that I could do different. Is there anything that like internally maybe bugs you about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess my own experience is I've got as much self-loathing as the rest of you. I mean, don't worry, you know, it's there. But I guess my attitude is something like, yeah, this is really unfortunate. It was a big mistake. I often have a bunch of regrets, and I think I had better do something that in some sense makes up for having just fucked around for a long time. But I do think at the same time that it's not particularly productive to dwell on that beyond what is required to recalibrate my own expectations for myself and my own priorities. And so I try to have this attitude of, well, okay, the main lesson for me to learn here is I'm a bit too invested, attached to this particular project. That means I should probably be asking 10 people if they think it's actually nearly as impactful as I would like it to be. And if their answer is not the one I would like to hear, I should still listen to them and not assume that my interests are the right ones to be pursuing in this particular case. I mean, I think Abraham Rowe, who many of you probably know, he was the COO of Rethink Priorities and then launched Good Structures, provides ops support for people in the movement. He once said to me, look, it would just be shocking if what we enjoyed doing most was best for the world. And it's like such an obvious observation. But as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, that's just clearly right. And I just need to keep that in mind much more often.
So we deal with quite horrible problem. I think many of us would consider ourselves privileged to be able to at least give a shot of changing how the world functions right now, how it treats animals. But at the same time, the things we wrestle with are horrible and very morally demanding. So, if you buy the premise that our work matters and it's so neglected and the scale of the problem is so big, for example, let's say that for $1 we can save 10 animals, and then let's say that someone gets $10 per hour. You can save 100 animals just by working 1 hour more, or making mistakes can be like disastrous for your morale and how you feel. Many people in the movement struggle with burnout, with this emotional baggage. Do you have any advice how we can be maybe more resistant to it? How can we, despite this horror, this moral demandingness, carry on our work without, losing morale, without like being affected by it?
So I guess my take on this is largely drawn from the way I think people handle this in other sorts of contexts. So you think about if you're an ER doctor, an emergency room doctor, and you spend all of your time dealing with, gunshot wounds and people who've accidentally found some way to swallow scissors and, kids who've fallen out of trees and, whatever else the case may be. What do those folks do? Well, there's a mix of gallows humor and dark humor that people turn to as a way of coping with these really bleak things. And I think probably some of the most cathartic moments that I've had is laughing about really awful things that, have occurred regarding animals with other animal people, as a way of just managing that feeling on some, in some way. So I do think that there are the same kinds of things that other people do that we can pursue. But I'll be honest that I mostly think that we're not built as organisms to deal with the level of catastrophe and the amount of knowledge and the scales that we deal with all the time. And so we just shouldn't be surprised by or that bothered by the fact that they break us sometimes. I'll just be driving along the road and I will see a dead deer or a dead squirrel and I'll just suddenly be sobbing, just completely uncontrollably sobbing in my car. And yeah, what am I supposed to do about that? It's just awful. It's just awful that little life was snuffed out. And I should, in some sense, appreciate what a calamity that is, And it's not unreasonable to be crushed by the horrors of the world. And at the same time, what else can you do other than pick up and keep moving? And we're going to burn out. We're going to have seasons where we just can't function, do this anymore. So that's not a super satisfying pragmatic answer for how do you get resilient? And my best thing to say is tell more dark jokes. But I'm actually I think it's okay to not be okay in the face of the gravity of the situations with which, we deal every day. So I don't think we should hold up mental wellness as the, of course I want you all to be mentally well, but I also don't think we should make too much of a idol about it. It's great if we can achieve it. It's wonderful. I want it. I want it for everyone. I support efforts to improve mental health. At the same time, it would be shocking if you cared about these things as much as the people who are willing to make the sacrifices here do and not be devastated.
Unless it's not cost effective to help people, right?
Well, then of course we just do whatever Vasco says about what's most cost effective,
Yeah, that's really, I really like that answer. It really resonates with me. So we have one question about this, about your background, and then we can move to the next topic. Michał asks, do animal rights movement needs more philosophy and philosophers? What could be the contribution?
Sorry, what was the first part?
Do animal rights movement needs more philosophy?
Does it need more?
Yeah, does it need more? Yeah.
So I mean, you're really asking an uncomfortable question for me specifically, as someone who has all of this angst about having made the choice to become a philosopher, right? So for me personally, the response is like, no, of course not. Like, we're the problem, like we're the people who wouldn't stop thinking and wouldn't focus on action, and wouldn't it have been so much better if we had just been willing to actually do something to improve the world? And we got distracted, and it's very unfortunate that we did. I think the most positive thing that I can say about this, for years I ran a society that was focused on getting more philosophers to work on animals. So I was invested in kind of field building in that domain. And when I thought about the good that they could do, I thought, what you've got here are a bunch of smart people with analytical skills that could be turned in really constructive, constructive ways. They could make various contributions, but it's mostly not as philosophers, right? It's mostly as people who have philosophical skills, have the kind of systemic thinking that philosophers are trained to do. And I think that can be really valuable. It can be good to be the kind of person who sees things in terms of an overarching narrative and wants to see how all the pieces fit together and exactly how the components fit. And that orientation could be used in productive ways because, of course, it's an important part of strategic thinking, right? Like, designing a good campaign involves, relentlessly thinking about the chain from the change that you want to see all the way back to the decision I make today. And I do think there are ways to contribute. But here's the problem on that front. It actually takes a bunch of unlearning for academics to be useful in that respect. Because, again, they get distracted by things that are not decision relevant. And so I'm wary about encouraging more academics now to join the space because I don't know that they're always keeping their eye on the prize. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Thank you. Okay, so we can move to one of the things that I think you're the most known from. It's a moral weight project. So what is moral weight project? And then I think I speak for many of us. Explain me like I'm 5. And can we ask production team to put this slide? There's should be there.
Anyway,
yeah.
while they're figuring out the slide. So here's the short version of that. So one thing that we want to do is reduce suffering, right? We are into there being less pain in the world. One of the questions that you then face is, all right, well, if you're trying to decide which animals you're going to help, where are you going to be able to reduce the most pain? Are you going to be able to reduce more pain if you're aiming at helping chickens than you will be if you're helping shrimp? Will you be able to help, reduce more pain if you are trying to work on pigs versus salmon? Like, where are the best opportunities, right? Some of those questions are straightforward empirical questions about like, well, how bad are the conditions in different kinds of facilities, right? But you might also think that animals have different abilities when it comes to feeling pain. You might think that, look, maybe maybe it's the case that a honeybee just can't feel pain as intensely as a pig. Maybe it's the case that a cow just has greater cognitive capacities, sensory capacities, whatever, that make it more vulnerable to injury, in the feeling sense, right, to feel bad, than say a prawn. If that's the case, seems important to know, right? Seems important to know. And what the Moral Weight Project does really is just say, all right, is there any tool that we can use? Is there any method we can use to start quantifying those differences and say, can we make any comparisons between how bad things are for a pig versus how bad things are for a, sea bream versus a shrimp, whatever. And the basic approach was, think really hard about all the things that different animals can do that we have any data about. Make a big inventory of all those traits. Figure out how those traits might bear any relation to how intensely you can feel pain, and then put it all together in a model. And so we did that over the course of a couple years. And the gist of that project was, yeah, there are probably some differences, and they're probably not huge. So not none, and maybe they matter, but our basic take was they probably don't matter nearly as much as the difference in the number of individuals. So, if you can help a relatively small number of pigs versus a lot of fish, the differences in the intensity of their pains is not going to be the thing that's going to make you think, go for the pigs rather than the fish. That's the gist of the Moral Weight Project.
So we have a slide. Can you maybe...
Oh, right. Yes, I totally forgot it. So this is a visual representation of the big review of the capacities of animals that we did. And essentially what you're seeing here, the gray is all the stuff we don't know. And, actually that's pretty important as a side note, because notice these are the most farmed animals, and basically no one's bothered to even investigate a zillion basic capacities that those animals have, right? No one cared enough to do the research, right? That's how little we're interested in the animals we use for food. So that's an interesting point in itself. But separately from that, essentially, the shades of blue represent, or the colors represent, how confident we are that the trait was possessed. And very roughly, you can think of this as more traits, likely greater capacity to feel pain, though the details are obviously more complicated than that.
So something that is, I'm not sure how intuitive, like why do we believe there's a range of welfare possible? One of the, I think, intuitive approach to sentience consciousness, however we'll define it, is just lights on. Do we suspect that this animal is sentient and it can feel pain rather than the intensity and some kind of spectrum? Why this approach?
Yeah, good. So the first thing is, when we're talking about sentience, we're talking about these two components, right? One is the consciousness question. Are the lights on or off, right? As you were saying. That's one component. The other component is, what kinds of conscious experiences are there? And when we're talking about sentience, what we're talking about is these valenced experiences that can be positive and negative, good and bad, right? For the organism experiencing them. And so the lights on, lights off question is primarily about, or at least it's as a first blush, first pass, it's going to be about consciousness. And then there's a second question, which is like, oh, is it also lights on or lights off with respect to the capacity to have these positive and negative experiences? And there, I think it's a lot less clear. It's a lot less obvious what to think. I think the basic way to feel the force of the idea of variation, and I'll come back around to why it might make sense not to think about variation. But look, animals differ in a ton of ways, right? They got different sensory capacities. They've got different cognitive capacities. Some of them seem to have more unity over time than others, right? They're more connected to their past selves and future selves than others. Some of them appear to have a greater understanding of temporal relations. Some of them seem to be able to think thoughts about other minds. Some of them seem to be able to think thoughts about their own minds. Some of them we have no behavioral evidence of any of that, right? So all this different, across species, all these differences across species, it would be kind of surprising if none of that made any difference to the way those animals experience the world, right? Now, it could be the case that it doesn't make any difference and that you feel just as intensely either way, but it seems like there's all this other variation. Why not variation along this axis as well? Or at least you might say something like, well, if we're uncertain, we should at least put a little bit of our credence on that possibility. And if we put a little bit of our credence on that possibility, then we should figure out, well, how big would the differences be if there were some, right? Now, you want to come back around to the...
No. Sorry. You want to continue or?
I can keep talking.
No. Okay. So one thing
right.
that I wanted to make a note for the benefit of us all. Sometimes when I read Bob Fischer work, it's very hard to follow because first it's very complicated and very sophisticated, but also sometimes very academic language. So it's a safe space. If someone wants to make Bob repeat something or is not sure about certain words, ask here. So yes, so I will ask maybe a few questions that are very good. So Christian asks, where are we at with brain volume versus number of electron collections in relation to this?
Oh, so I take it the question there, if I'm understanding correctly, and tell me if I'm not understanding correctly, is one thing you might want is proxies. You might want indicators that you can use to decide how important is this animal, right? How much should I care about the suffering of this animal? And one thing you could do is be like, let's spend a lot of money and make pretty graphs like we did and do this like massive survey of behaviors and cognitive capacities. Another option is to be like, well, what if we just looked at the difference in the number of neurons or the difference in brain mass or the difference in brain volume and just use that as our kind of rough and ready proxy. I think the short thing to say about that is, look, it's really important to remember that we're doing different things here for different purposes. Like, if your job requires you to make some rough and ready calculations, and what you got to do is throw together a BOTAC, like a little back of the envelope calculation to decide, should I spend money on A or B? And you're like, I don't know how much to care about chickens versus pigs. I'm just going to throw some neuron count numbers in there as just a starting point, because it feels to me like pigs are more sophisticated than chickens. Like, look, that's not crazy. I understand doing that. You got to start somewhere. And we should all be really uncertain in this domain. And it's not crazy to think in those terms, right? And to just say, you got to do something when you got to make decisions. And if that's our best option, fine, right? But there's a further question, which is, can I give, Jakub here a good argument that the correct answer, or the answer that is most likely to be correct, is given by brain volume versus neuron counts versus Bob's multi-criterial model versus something else. And I think there what we can point out is, look, there's just lots of evidence that things like brain volume or brain mass are really determined by other factors that don't have anything to do with the experience of the animal. Like birds gotta fly, penguins aside, right? So they gotta have really light brains, which means that their brains have fewer neurons than you might predict relative to the number, to their body size, and they're more densely packed, right? So if you use some of those proxies, you might think like, well, birds, not that impressive. But actually, birds can do like really impressive things with those brains. And we can see when we look at the behavioral tests that we're not predicting the abilities that we might have thought we would predict using those kind of coarse-grained neurological proxies. And so I think, yeah, they're probably not the best. Does that mean that, what I did is the best? No, it doesn't mean that, right? But it means that we should, if we're trying to think about not how do I make decisions given information and time constraints, but rather what do I think is optimal, then yeah, probably those coarse-grained neurological proxies aren't the way to go, would be my take.
Okay, but with that, and also you showed like how much we miss information. There's no evidence, nobody bothered to study. Can there be an argument that using any proxy when research is so limited is worse than just like, having intuition, looking at animals, seeing how mouse behaves instead of like, oh, we don't have research when they have some sophisticated cognitive behavior? Isn't just being in the dark sometimes better than having false confidence because of lack of evidence? Because now some researchers and people can say, oh, fish are not as important as some other species, but maybe this guys give us this false confidence because fish are very weird and hard to study in terms of like behavior or other characteristics.
Yeah, so I do think that risk is real. And I think the only way to get at this is to look at the decision-making context. Like, think about the way economists operated and still sometimes operate, where an economist is trying to figure out, well, what should be done over here? What policy would be best? Well, let's use how much income people have as a proxy for how well their lives are going, right? Now, income, not a perfect proxy, not a totally accurate way of figuring out how happy and satisfied people are with their lives. In fact, in many ways, a very poor proxy. But if that's the only thing you've got, and you've got to make a decision about, which policy is best, and you think that like there probably genuinely are some differences between people that income tracks, okay, it's not crazy to do that, right? But there are other contexts where we don't want people to differentiate based on something like income, and we just want to have each person counts for one, and we don't adjust in any sort of way, right? And we have to recognize, like, well, which situation are we in? Like, is this a situation where it's better to have a coarse, bad, third-rate proxy? Or is this a situation where we should just let the number of individuals affected determine what we do? And I think, if you're an effective altruist and you're super into the numbers, you might think every context is one where we use the proxy, right? And if you're someone who's used to thinking in terms of animal rights, you're like, what? Like, why would you ever even start down this path, right? So there's both, I think, sometimes a philosophical disagreement, and there are pragmatic disagreements about whether we're in the kind of situation where using a less than ideal proxy is still an improvement. And it takes judgment, and you got to think about like what the costs and benefits are. I don't think there's really any other way around that.
Okay, there are some questions about methodology of this from people. Connor asked, how does duration of pain factor into moral weight according to the model?
Yeah, so it doesn't factor in at all. And the reason for that is because that's like a downstream component of a calculation that you would then do. So the way to think about what we did in the moral weight project was just to ask this very narrow question, like, in principle, at a moment, how well and badly can things go for you, right? And then, of course, you got to add on to that a bunch of empirical information. You got to figure out, okay, well, how badly off is this animal? Like, how badly off is it a chicken when it can't reach a perch? How badly off is a pig when, a piglet when the teeth are clipped? Whatever. Like, you got to actually go and do some welfare science, and you got to figure out, really intense pain, mild pain, and then you adjust that by this, this moral weight number. And then does it last for a long time, short time, multiply through to get some overall amount of pain that you think you're dealing with. But it's not a substitute for all of that. So it's not an all-inclusive number. It's just looking at, hey, how intense could this pain be, right? That's all we're getting at with that number.
So how deep dive did you do when constructing this? Did you filter out like junk science? We have problem in academia with, publish or perish. There's a lot of studies that would be maybe even for most people here incredibly basic and not really, flawed. Have you done some filtering?
Yeah. So basically what we did was, so I went out and I just found a bunch of people who were taxonomic experts, people who had worked with those species, and a bunch of graduate students and early career faculty who had some expertise and said, okay, I don't know anything about chickens. You're someone who's worked with these birds. Like, you review the literature and you tell me what I should think about the presence or absence of these traits. And so I trusted their expertise, and then we did some spot checking. So we said, all right, go through, 20%, have someone else who also has some expertise go through 20% of these cases and tell me, would you come with the same conclusion? And if they did in all those cases, then we said, that's good enough as a check. And if they didn't more than a couple of times, we said, okay, we need to go through the whole review again.
Okay, there's interesting question from Aaron. In your slide, I see that no farm animals clearly exhibit things like jealous behavior to sympathy behavior. And then this 36 to 47 in the graph. My dog seems to exhibit jealous behavior. It seems that pigs are similar to dogs. Why is it unclear in research that animals like pigs do not experience things like jealousy or empathy? Maybe if pig match you, Aaron, then they will be jealous maybe about you and not. Well, yeah.
So this is a great question, and I think it's a very reasonable basis to criticize the project, because essentially what we said was, look, your job is to figure out what the published literature says about the capacity of these animals. You don't get to just say, I'm pretty sure, therefore, right? Now, what that means is it rules out a lot of stuff that actually there's like reasonably good evidence for, right? And in fact, that these people knew, right? Because they'd worked with these animals. And they were like, I actually know that salmon can do this thing, but I can't find a paper about it. And so we had to decide, like, well, what's the right approach? And because we were interested in trying to do something that we thought someone could reproduce, we thought, okay, we just need to limit it to the published research. But that does mean it's leaving out information. And it means that there's going to be a special bias against understudied species, right? So we don't really know that much about shrimp because nobody cares about them, right? And so of course, like, there aren't a bunch of really interesting cognitive and behavioral tests that anyone's done on those animals. And that does stack the deck, right? Whereas people are super excited about honeybees, so we know a bunch about them, right? So that's built in. And that's one of the reasons why I just don't think you should take the numbers that seriously. Like, you should see them as a general update against thinking that there are massive differences. But you shouldn't be like, oh yeah, out to 6 decimal places, Bob's got this nailed. Like, that's not the way to react to the numbers.
So why people are obsessed about honeybees?
I mean, the environmental movement is just so much better than us at like getting people excited about stuff, and of course it's part because we just they doesn't really ask anything of anybody, like, oh, take shorter showers, like not give up, your favorite meal. I think, the environmental movement just clearly did an incredible job campaigning on pollinators as being important and frame bees as these like, cuddly, buzzing, puppies, and everyone was just like, okay, great, So, and they won the hearts and minds.
And how does it translate to academia? Like, how public support? Is it just environmental groups funding research, or? Yeah,
so it's just the case that, like, if you want, it is actually shocking. So I spend a lot of time talking with entomologists now, which is not a twist that I expected in my life, but that is in fact my life. The number of them that work on bees is just staggering. Like, all the money is bee money. Big B is just like totally cleaning up.
Wake up, people.
That's right. Exactly right. That's exactly right. So it's just so much easier to get funded because there just genuinely are pollinator, it's a pollinator crisis. And so the USDA has pumped a huge amount of money into bee research, and it's made it an easy thing for people to work on.
Okay. Andrew asks, what has been the most surprising result from research you have done?
So I came just, cards on the table. Like, I came into this project with the attitude that, like, yeah, we're going to basically vindicate Bob's intuitions because, that's just the way this thing's going to get it's probably the way it's going to play out, because of course, super biased in the way that everybody is. And I've written papers arguing that, like, it's fine to eat insects, it's fine to farm them, that they probably aren't conscious. And I was fairly skeptical and like pretty kind of like morally committed to them not mattering, because I thought it was just sort of silly to take this possibility seriously. And now I run two nonprofits focused on insects. And so that for me was the biggest shift. And I will say that, like, it's partly the actual work that we did, but it was partly just reading around and realizing I don't know anything about a gecko that would explain why that thing matters more than a honeybee. Like, I just can't find anything about this turtle that would explain why it's more important than a wasp. Like, there just aren't impressive abilities in lots of these vertebrates that would make it clear why we should think that they've got some special cognitive capacities, or that they have, much more intense pains, or what have you. And that just got me thinking, like, well, either I get really skeptical about frogs and snakes, or I get a bit friendlier to the bugs. And I decided erring on the side of caution meant being a bit friendlier to the bugs.
So what happens inside Bob? Do you just convince yourself, like, rationally that this is the thing, or do you actually now think, oh, those are small fuzzy puppies, like black soldier flies?
No, I definitely don't feel that way. I often still feel crazy, frankly, working on this. I kind of resent it and wish I didn't have to do this.
Resent what?
I resent the fact that I'm spending all of my time working on bugs. I would feel a lot better about myself, and more, I could, like, less crazy, more morally superior, etc., if I were working on pigs or something. Because I can say to my mom, like, Mom, what they're doing to these pigs is horrifying. And my mom, who couldn't care less about animals, is still like, well, I know it's kind of bad, So, like, even though she doesn't care, she gets it, And then I'm like, yeah, actually now I'm kind of working on black soldier fly larvae. And Mom's like, my son, well, you have gone so wrong. And part of me thinks, like, yeah, Mom, I mean, like, what am I supposed to tell you? What am I supposed to tell you? This is tough to swallow, and I don't really want to believe it. But the thing that I come back to when I feel that way is one thing I've already said, which is, what do I know about these other animals that explains why they would be so much more important? And yeah, I do think there are things about pigs that make them special compared to black soldier fly larvae. But, there isn't that much about, again, like, a baby turtle that explains why they're more important. And I care about baby turtles. That's one thing. And then the other thing is just thinking about size bias. Like, I've said this a million times, and I'm sorry for repeating it, but, like, just imagine that, bees were as big as rhinos and had the same cognitive capacities, could think all the same thoughts. And you'd be like, man, I love bees like an environmentalist. Like, I am all in on the bees because now they weigh a ton.
Can you maybe unpack more the size bias? I think, like, I'm not sure how many people know about a lot of biases, but you mentioned casually. But what if, I think it's important thing to make sure that people.
I think it literally is quite often when things are small, when there are lots of them, when we can't really see their behaviors very well, when they're kind of irritating, et cetera, like, of course, we just have a hard time thinking they matter, right? But if you just imagine them big and few in number and not irritating, right? So imagine that an ant is like, again, elephant size, and there are only 100 of them left, and they're really friendly, you know? And suddenly you're like, oh, there's nothing I love more than ants. You know, like it's all it takes for your intuitions, I think, to flip about these animals, where you start recognizing like, oh, I am just reacting to the fact that I have no idea what's going on down there on the ground, you know? And I think once we recognize that about ourselves and recognize how much we are affected by numerosity and size and other kinds of factors, we quickly realize like, okay, we should correct ourselves a little bit. So the cognitive capacity similarities, plus this thought about like our inherent cognitive biases, those are the things that sort of keep me going and thinking this is worth working on.
Nice. So it seems like you clearly trust those results enough to talk to your mother about those, and how much we should trust them. Like, what's the trajectory? Do you think that people should update what they do, change what they do? What's the resilience level of this evidence so far, especially that we don't know so much?
Yeah. So just to be clear, if you go and you look at the reports or the book, you know, I think the actual numbers are just not that interesting at all. Like you should basically not care about them. What you should think about them is as, you know, broad order of magnitude kinds of estimates. Like, well, just ballparking, where are we? And you should think about them as an update relative to where you might have been. So I was writing for people who were inclined to think that animals really didn't matter at all. You know, like my orientation, the people I was working on this project for were effective altruists who were not into animals. Like that's the target of the Moral Weight Project. That's why we did it, was we were speaking to those people. We were not speaking to other animal people, right? And so our attitude was like, let's try to figure out how good are the arguments for really big differences? And we thought, actually, arguments for really big differences, not so good, right? So probably you should think smaller differences, right? And that's a big update for that crowd. If you're working in animal advocacy and you're already very into animals, like, I do think it should be some update for you that like, yeah, okay, if you were inclined to totally rule out shrimp or totally rule out insects, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. But I don't think it means all the money goes to the bugs, right? I don't think it means all the money should go to the most numerous animals just because they're the most numerous. And the reason for that is because I think, well, one, of course, we could be getting it wrong. Like there are ways we could have made really significant mistakes, and I'm very concerned about that. But also because, you know, the way I approach these things, the way I think about decision making is we want robust results. You want a bunch of different lines of evidence converging on a conclusion before you start throwing money at it. And I think the Moral Weight Project, it's one line of evidence. It says, yeah, maybe the bugs matter more than you thought. And then you got to think about, are there others? Like, do they converge in that spot? And I can point to a few others, right? I can give you a couple of other things. You can just think about, well, what would a general precautionary principle say here? What would, you know, the kind of like, if you don't know, be cautious kind of approach imply in these circumstances? That might also update you a bit toward bugs. What should you think about the fact that actually some of these animals are really powerful pain models for studying human pain? That's kind of uncomfortable. Maybe that should, another line of evidence, update you a little bit, etc. And if there are enough of them, then you start to think, okay, this isn't just like one guy's or one team's thought, but maybe some non-trivial chunk of the money goes in this direction. And that's the way I think about the robustness of the result. It's confirmed a bit, given a little support by this range of evidence, but still, we should be cautious because, there isn't that much work on this. Early days in thinking about these important topics.
So if I understand correctly, this project, most of this work rests on you in significant degree. You are the person who selected experts, talked with them, so still there is some filtering that your brain did. If you had to be, third-party observer of yourself, of your life, we know already that you made some poor choices.
Terrible choices.
Like
Terrible.
Philosophy, all this kind of stuff. So what is your track record? Like how much we should trust, the person who present this to us?
So all I can say about that, well, I mean, there are two things to say about that. So one is, since you are all animal people, right? I mean, maybe there's some
Spice.
If so, please leave before. But actually, it's too late now. I mean, the conference is practically over. But if there were people here who just didn't care about animals at all, that would be an interesting group to push back on this, because those folks, they could say, well, I mean, Bob was kind of writing for those folks. He really was trying to put some pressure on people who were thinking that animals didn't matter at all. Of course, he wants to say that animals matter a lot. There's a reason to suspect bias in that domain. That being said, that's not the audience here, right? You are mostly animal people. And I really didn't want it to work out this way. I wasn't pushing for this. I was hoping to work on chickens, and I'm actually a very conservative person temperamentally, and very cautious about belief revision. And so this isn't the way I thought it would go or wanted it to go. And so I think that is a reason to be actually more optimistic that I got it in the ballpark of the truth, that we should be updating in a invertebrate friendly direction, versus the actual human-animal trade-off bit.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is good evidence, but there are also some things that can play in different direction. Maybe there's a benefit of being the first who does work, or controversial. Maybe you want to torture a bit your mother. There can be some things that can make it also ego or things like that. Do you think that can be at play?
So, I mean, you should never rule it out, first of all. Second thing to say is, I mean, all you can do is look at the stuff I wrote before, where, do you have a paper in American Entomologist arguing in defense of the industry that kills trillions of bugs a year? I don't think you do. I do, so I really thought that that was the right thing to do. And I put my money where my mouth was, as it were, in publishing those pieces.
So building on that, about how should we trust, there's very popular question from Andrew. If you could change one thing about the animal movement overnight to be more impactful, what would it be?
That's a good question. I don't know that it would necessarily have anything to do with this. I would love to have a little bit more help. There is lots of work we could do with a few more people who are willing to spend some time working on invertebrates, because there are lots of them and there is so much low-hanging fruit. But I think in general, if I were making one change and I was not sort of bracketing this question about those sorts of priorities, I think that what the animal movement needs more of is people who are ruthlessly focused on animals, and are avoid being distracted by all the other things that we can care about in the context of the movement. And like, it's easy to also care about health, or also care about how we look to other progressive causes, or also really care about, how we fit into some national political narrative, or all these other sorts of things. But just updating a little bit toward thinking, my organization, my career is about nothing more than seeing a particular change for animals. I think we often talk that way, but in fact, when we look at the way we structure our operations, they are less like that. They're more focused on respectability, or more focused on fitting into the wider social change movement, or what have you. So that is the thing that I'm sort of most interested in trying to figure out how to do more in my own work, and that I think is probably the single sort of ruthless change that I would love to see elsewhere.
Okay. So there's a question from Cyril. Are you also reviewing the existing literature, or also creating new research to plug the knowledge gaps?
Largely not. So I think that would be a great thing for other people to do. I don't think that's a great thing for advocacy dollars to do. And so, because it's very expensive to do science, basically. So if you're going to pay for science, you got to be really confident that it's going to be useful, somewhere in the movement. You're going to be able to make change based on it. So I am actually funding science, but it's welfare science on invertebrates, where I think that the difference between us having an ask and not having an ask is getting those answers. But that's the only kind of science that I'm personally interested in putting money into at this point. I do agree, though, would be great to know a lot more about the cognitive capacity of these animals. However, you can probably trust scientists to investigate those things out of their own curiosity over time.
Okay. Chris asks, might size bias be a reasonable heuristic, given that body size can correlate with factors such as nervous system complexity, neuron count, metabolic investment in the brain, which in turn may relate to cognitive capacities? Yeah.
So like we were talking about with other proxies, there are lots of contexts where that might be a reasonable thing to do, right? But notice that probably you're not really using size as a proxy in any clean, straightforward way. You're not being like, well, here's the mass of a pig, here's the mass of the honeybee, divide, right? That's the ratio. And then calculating to see, well, how many honeybees could I help versus how many pigs? And does that discount rate affect my prioritization? What people, I think, tend to do is just use size as a kind of way of zeroing out and saying that doesn't matter at all. And I actually think, this is an area where, not to pick on Vasco, but this is an area where, if any of you know Vasco, Vasco's been writing a lot about very small animals. And I think this is a thing that is really important about his work, is that he's trying to say to people, don't just get suckered by the fact that they're really small and you can't practically see them. That's not a reason not to care. And whether or not we agree with particular conclusions about which animals to prioritize and how much, getting past size alone as a reason for zeroing out is really important. And then recognizing that there are an awful lot of them, so if any of them matter, that should show up in our thinking.
Okay, we'll slowly go to the questions more about moral philosophy, because people are hungry for controversy.
Oh, good.
And thank you all for a lot of good questions. I'm not sure if I will be able to ask all, but they are really good. So I have a question that's similar for Connor, maybe a bit of changing the movement, but do you think we are doing something now that as animal advocacy that we will consider with quite high confidence in future as a moral error? There's this good, analogy of few decades ago, factory farming was being created, and animal advocates were mostly working on horses or domestic animals. And maybe if they would be mobilized back then and try to stop it, or at least try this, then we would not have, jobs now. But it could be extremely, extremely important to stop. Do you see anything that maybe now we do in a similar fashion?
So, I mean, that's a great question. And I think probably there are things where, you know, if the evidence keeps going the way I think it's going to go, then yeah, I think we probably will regret not having spent more on various invertebrate animals. I think we will regret not having pivoted to fish earlier and harder. You know, I do think this is where a huge amount of the impact is to be had, and that does seem like a really important thing. But that kind of issue aside, I think there are lots and ways in which, like, again, I don't think the movement has gotten ruthless enough in its focus where, you know, we still want to see longevity in organizations. I think we probably should be more willing to shut stuff down because we're not actually seeing the kind of impact. And we should be creating an ecosystem structure that is friendlier to failure and says like, look, you launched this thing, awesome. It didn't do what you thought it was going to do in the first 3 years. Great. Here's bridge funding to help you find the next thing. Shut this down. Stop putting money into it. Stop telling funders that it really has a shot if you just get 18 more months of runway. And now I need you to prioritize something else. Come up with a new theory of change in a new area. We saw that was not running the way we thought it was going to run.
So, as we said, it's safe space. If you had to say one thing that you think should be shut down, you are now a monarch of animal advocacy.
Yeah. Well, so I think I can sincerely say that I didn't have anything in mind when I said that.
Yeah, but...
so, I mean, I think, so to pick on my own, and poor Marcus, just, I feel bad already. But like, I think Rethink...
Marcus is CEO of...
CEO of Rethink Priorities. Like, I think Rethink Priorities is a great example of this, where it's like, hey, Rethink Priorities, it is a research organization that has tried to do a lot of good in the space. One question to ask is like, should it exist as the effective altruism space has changed so much? Like the effective altruism space at one time prided itself on really being a movement where the global health people were also in the same room as the animal people, were also in the same room as the existential risk people, and we were all chatting. Well, guess what? We're not chatting, you know? The animal people are doing their own thing. The global health people are doing their own thing. The AI people have gone off entirely on their own at this point, right? And so do we need a cross-cause org? I don't know that that makes sense anymore. And so that's the kind of thing where I think like that's a hard question that RP needs to face.
Attacking ex-employer. Suspicious. Okay.
I'm still 20%
okay.
at RP.
Still. Okay, so Tobias asks, how do you think about suffering of a large number of farmed animals in relation to the probably worse suffering but lower number of primates in experiments?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different questions you could be asking, right? I mean, one question you could be asking is, you know, for which animal do I feel worse at the individual pairwise comparison, one-to-one, you know? And of course, I feel worse for the animal suffering more, right? You know, another question is it strategic to go to advocate for the most sympathetic animals first and, you know, end primate experimentation before you do anything else? And there I think like, yeah, probably not. We seem not actually to be able to go that much further when it comes to primate experimentation. It's already come down a huge amount from where it was. And as soon as there are crises like COVID, primate experimentation just shot back up because it was the easiest way to get certain kinds of vaccine testing done. So, you know, given that, probably ought to focus on the animals suffering a bit less just because there are so many more of them. And then, of course, there are a bunch of like other kinds of questions we could possibly ask here. But I think like when we refine the question a bit, I suspect there's not that much disagreement really about how to feel about many of these different kinds of trade-offs.
There's a very good question that I want to ask, going maybe against what I said to methodology. Aaron asks, are there any meta patterns in the data? For example, is there a pattern that the more a species studied, like bees, the more capacity for cognitive experience there is discovered?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, basically, the more you look, the more you find with all these animals. And that's not totally true, because some animals are just easier to study. So, you know, if you get into it's called the ethology literature, which is the study of animal cognition and behavior. And some animals are more intuitive to people. We find it more intuitive to design studies that get behavior that we can then use to understand their cognitive abilities, right? Some animals are not like that. So, for instance, like people have a very hard time motivating fish in all kinds of experiments, whereas they have an easier time motivating other kinds of animals, like pigs, to do certain things. And that just means that it's a lot easier to figure out what a pig can do and the kinds of puzzles it can solve than it is to figure out, again, like what a sea bream can do. And so this is just a limitation of our ability. So yes, it's partly how much people look, but it's partly how much basically we are smart enough to figure out how smart animals are, you know, to borrow the phrase from Franz de Waal.
So there's a question from Connor. Are you a hardcore utilitarian? And maybe building on that, this seems very utilitarian, at least at the surface. Let's say that I come to the research with very different moral worldview, that something else maybe matters. How does those research and those conclusions would change?
Good. So two questions there. There's the question about me and the question about the research. So on the question about me, I'm not a utilitarian. So the project, is assuming utilitarianism because the people we were writing for were utilitarians, or at least utilitarian-ish, utilitarian-friendly. I myself have no theoretical commitments. Like I actually find it shocking when people just say things like, "Oh yeah, I'm a negative utilitarian," or like, "Oh yeah, I subscribe to animal rights," and I'm always like, "How did you do that? Like what? How the arguments are so complicated. There's so many considerations. How did you reach that view? Like I've never understood that relationship to big philosophical theories, to moral theories. I still don't understand it. It just feels to me like, man, everything is so complicated. All I can do is try to understand how things look from a bunch of views that seem kind of plausible and try to figure out what seems like the right thing to do given where these things overlap and converge and make similar recommendations." So I'm just extremely uncertain at the level of theory, even though I'm like pretty confident about some practical matters, because I think like, oh yeah, they just do all kind of point in the same direction on some things. That, by the way, was part of why I was so interested in working on chickens, because I'm like, I don't care where you start. Factory farming chickens, not a good idea. Shouldn't do it. You know, like give me any starting moral assumption and I can get you to chicken farming is a bad idea. Don't do it, right? Whereas I can't do that with some of the things I work on now. I'm sticking my neck out a bit more to do it. So go ahead.
No. Yeah. I sense good thought.
The second thought, though, is about like, well, how much does any of this depend on your assumptions? Look, I don't care what moral theory you've got. Just about everybody's moral theory's got some room for welfare. Everybody's theory is going to care about pain, right? So that's going to show up someplace, right? The animal rights people are not around saying like, well, I don't care about pain. I only care about whether their rights are respected. Like, no. Of course, one way you violate their rights is by causing them pain, right? And if you cause them more pain, in some sense, that's a worse rights violation than a very, very minor pain, right? They both might be rights violations, but they can differ in severity. So this can still matter regardless of what moral view you have. You're just going to think about the implications a bit differently right? The way you're going to put it all together to justify a judgment might change a lot, like a practical conclusion might change, but the relevance can still be there.
So I agree pretty much on factory farming, but there can be very different consequences, it feels, for practices outside of factory farming, like, for example, wild animal suffering and their well-being. For example, yesterday on a Fireside chat, Martin Balog, and I hope I will not butcher your worldview, said that, of course, well-being matters, but like what matters the most is ultimate goal for rights is autonomy of animals, and then we have no right to violate this autonomy if they're, roaming wilderness and being on their own. Does it translate anyway in those research? Does it change it in any way? Or maybe your conclusions, your personal take?
So there are a few things to say here. So one is, like bracket, we'll come back to the wild animal case in just 1 second. If we're thinking about regular farmed animal advocacy, and I assume that Martin would agree with this, just that it probably is not going to make that much difference because things that compromise welfare, violate rights, vice versa, it's going to be the same. We're just going to agree about most of that stuff. And so for that chunk of advocacy, we can separate that out.
Plus, for the context for the video, Martin is nodding. So.
Good. That's good. We got that one right. That's great. So the second thing is, think about how this conversation goes from the perspective of someone like me, given what I just said about the way, like how impressed I am by uncertainty, how bothered I am by theoretical disagreement and things like that. So I hear about Martin's view and I think that's a really compelling view. I'm not sure that I'm totally in on the idea that autonomy is what matters most, but sure feels like it does matter. And that's a reason for me to think that working on factory farming is a more morally robust option than working on wild animal suffering. Because I agree that in the case of wild animal suffering, respecting their autonomy might not be the same thing as promoting their welfare. And that tension is real. And so I would not want, if you make me czar for the day, I don't give all the money to wild animals. I don't give all the money to bugs, right? I give a lot of the money, the bulk of the money still, to ending factory farming. Because I think, again, we're just not going to end up being wrong about that. Sort of no matter how our process of moral discovery goes, the considerations are going to support that. So because I'm interested in that kind of robustness, that's the way I think about this choice. Now, that being said, if we're sort of now focused more not on the practical matter, but on this theoretical question of how should we think about rights, relative to welfare, and especially when it comes to wild animals, I think, I am sympathetic to the idea that we should really care about the autonomy of wild animals, and it matters that they get choices about how to live their lives. And I think then the question is, when we're focused on things from a rights perspective, how informed are those choices? So in the case of human beings, we care about people's autonomy, but we also want people to be making informed choices that are informed by information about their own futures, about the way things are going to go for them if we don't intervene, And so if the person says, well, I don't really want this treatment, but they don't realize that if they don't get this treatment, they'll die, and they would prefer to go on living, well, now this is a trickier spot. And that's why, at least in the case of kids, we override their autonomy because we think, no, you don't actually have enough information and the ability to forecast in the right way for you to make these judgment calls. And so that's why I think actually, and of course we do the same thing for our animals, like our cats and dogs. People generally don't feel that bad about taking their animals to the vet, which they hate a lot of the time because we think it's in their long-term interests, right? And we recognize this as a compromise of their welfare in the short term, and to some degree a compromise of their autonomy, but we think it's worth it. So I think that you can care about autonomy and still think you should do some wild animal welfare work, but you'd want to look for those cases where we think, yeah, these animals really would sort of be better off by their own lights if they could reason more clearly about this, if they knew more. And so that might be something like, intervening in a way that prevents certain kind of diseases, even if the treatment is kind of unpleasant, right? Or it might mean something like, discouraging animals from getting access to spaces that they might want to get access to, because actually they would be at greater risk if they were to have access to those spaces, right? Because they would get injured by cars or whatever. So I do think that we can take animal autonomy seriously and recognize that even from a perspective that really privileges animal autonomy, compromising that for the sake of their welfare can sometimes be justified. That's my take.
No nodding, but no shaking. We don't know. We'll see next year. Okay, so on the note of wild animals, Vashko asked, could the animal welfare community be too attached to farmed animals instead of focusing on wild animals? And he says that there are like 10 billion wild animals for each farmed animal.
Yep. We could be making that mistake. And it's one to worry about. And I think, again, you can imagine the kind of thing that I want to say. Part of it is the stuff about how good are the arguments for intervening across the various uncertainties that we have? The other questions are going to be about the practicalities. Look, you got to set up a talent pipeline. You got to find ways of recruiting people into things. Is working on factory farming a better recruiting tool? It might not be. It could be that it's actually easier to recruit people to work on wild animal welfare because maybe it's the case that actually, everybody kind of cares that the hedgehogs don't get run over, And so I think there's a lot of practical, pragmatic questions you have to ask about to what degree could we reconstitute an effective movement that was focused on this, also recognizing our level of uncertainty about the effects of our actions and the moral justification for intervention. So it's a big, long, important research program that I encourage some people to do. I am actually spending a little bit of my time on this exact thing, trying to identify more wild animal interventions and building up a database of those interventions so that people can take a look at them and think about what are their pros and cons and what are their risks and to what degree would it be better if we put some resources into this versus the other things we might be considering.
Okay. There is a hot topic now among very peculiar people of, based on your research, of nematodes. It's become some sort of a meme, but also maybe some very serious consideration. Can you explain? Probably most of people here don't know about nematodes. Maybe I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly.
Yeah.
Can you explain what it is and why it's a thing?
Yeah. So, nematodes are very little worms. And there are a lot of them. And they don't have very many, little tiny brains, not even really brains, like 302 neurons in the most famous of these nematodes. And you might start to worry that once you start caring about the insects, where does it ever stop? Is the next thing that we should be putting all the money into, springtails and mites, these little creatures that live in the ground, or into the nematodes, or into bacteria, or maybe we just go all the way and it's just quarks that we should be worrying about, where does it ever stop? Once you've started going down this path, as you go down this path, what happens is the number of individuals gets larger. And so even if your probability that they matter goes way down, it's big number times little number still ends up being a really big number, right? And so you can end up with this conclusion that these tiny, 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 tiny creatures end up dominating our calculations, and that's where all the resources should go. as you might, and let's just start by saying what I think is good and right about this. One, we should care about the numbers. We should care about the numbers. And to go back to the primate versus the chicken case, like, it's a lot of chickens relative to those primates in labs. And surely that counts for something. And it would be a mistake if we didn't think about just how many individuals were affected. So that should really matter. The second thing to say is that it's also true that it's really hard to be precise about these probabilities. And you might think that these probabilities are the kinds of probabilities you can ignore. But like, if you did a good faith, honest to God, stare the numbers, in the eye, really try to figure it out, maybe they wouldn't be so low that you could just ignore them, right? Maybe the probability that these animals matter wouldn't be so low that you could just ignore them. So we should acknowledge that numbers matter. We should acknowledge that ruling things out based on low probabilities isn't as easy as you might think. And we should acknowledge that we as a movement and as people generally have gotten so many things wrong. What's one more? Like, the world is, the story of the world is the story of moral catastrophes that we all thought were great. That's the story of the world. And so why not think we've got one more? We should be very open to the possibility of serious moral blind spots. All of those considerations cut in favor of saying, put more money into the nematodes, the springtails, the bugs, etc. I think it's not easy to figure out how you draw a line. Here's how I do it. You can see what you think. I've got two things I'm balancing. One is I want lots of reasons pointing in one direction, right? So I'm looking for robustly good options in that sense. I want to be able to say, whatever your assumptions, they point in the same direction. Or at least you can take a lot of assumptions that are going to point in one direction. So I'm looking for things that have that kind of robustness because I'm concerned that I maybe not just, I can be wrong about ethics too. Like, I can have the wrong values. Like, part of moral error, part of the history of moral catastrophe is it's having the wrong views. So I really want to be robust to that. That's one thing. And the other thing is I want to try to avoid doing things that could really badly backfire. That could make things way worse. Right? And so what you want then is to find a balance between these two where you find the ideal things are robustly good, right? Good from lots of perspectives, and there doesn't really seem to be a downside. Improving slaughter for pigs, really robust in both senses. Pretty much anywhere you start seems crazy to make an animal like that suffer a ton. And it seems really obvious that, like, there's really no downside to just killing them more humanely, right? Like, if we're going to kill them, we don't have to make them suffer for a long time. Make it fast, knock them out, right? That's a robust option in both senses. But as you start thinking about something like putting all the money into bugs, including the stuff I do, right? It's less robust on the normative side, on the arguments for it side. There are fewer starting points that end up having you care about this topic. And there are more ways it could backfire, more ways it could potentially make things worse, right? Maybe it undermines the movement, right? Maybe it delegitimizes us all. Maybe it causes us to pay huge opportunity costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Especially if we go all in.
We are running out of time, so last sentence.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
But the short version is, I think that's the thing to say to back off the nematodes. Like, it's just not that robust in either sense, and that's the thing to be concerned about. At least by my lights. Thank you so much.
To be continued. not finished. There's one question that is highlighted by the team for some reason, and I'm not sure if I will, and it's yes or no question, and I don't know if I will pronounce it correctly, but Aaron asks, has anyone ever told you that you look like a buff John Cusack? Is this how you pronounce it? Yes
no,
or no?
I have
yes
not
or
heard that.
Yes or no?
No.
Okay. And then I will ask the rapid questions, and you can. This will be very short session of overrated, underrated. I will ask Bob whether he thinks the topic is underrated or overrated, and there is no definition what it means. And you can then ask him what the hell on the after parties when he will be dancing and stuff. So, researchers.
Overrated.
Working with academia.
Overrated.
I was worried. There will be like speech. Big animal advocacy organizations.
Sorry.
Big animal advocacy organizations, so big ones.
Overrated.
Cooperation in the movement.
Underrated.
Transparency.
Overrated.
Moral realism.
Underrated.
Ooh. Thought experiments.
Underrated.
Utilitarianism.
Overrated.
Deontology.
Overrated.
Deferring to others.
Underrated.
Moral intuitions.
Overrated.
Being virtuous.
Underrated.
Info hazards.
Overrated.
Artificial intelligence.
Overrated.
Corporate change.
Underrated.
Policy change.
Underrated.
Animal liberation.
Underrated.
Rethink priorities.
Overrated.
CARE conference.
Underrated.
And on that note, thank you, Bob. This was amazing.